This is a help file to help you with the central nervous system anatomy that you're going to be required to know as part of your lab practical that's coming up. So you're going to follow along with the arrow here and try to name the structures as I call them out here. So here, name this structure. Name this external covering structure of the brain. Dura mater. And below the dura mater I can see the cerebellum's peeking out here. Not a very good view, but I can make out that that is a cerebellum. I can see the spinal cord here. And now when I remove the dura mater to see what's under it, now I can see the superior view of my sheep brain. And name this brain area. Name this entire brain area. The cerebrum. And we can see that the cerebrum is separated, two parts here, separated by a fissure here. Name this fissure. Longitudinal fissure. I can see that the cerebrum is all wrinkled up. It's got infoldings in it. Name the ridges. Name the ridges. A single ridge is a gyrus. Plural of gyrus is gyri. The valleys, the invaginations that go into the brain here, name the valleys. Single valley is known as a sulcus, plural is sulci. Here, name this demarcation. In the sheep brain, this is not particularly well defined here, not like it is on the human brain, which you'll see better on the model. I can make it out here. And this is going to be the central sulcus. Now, anterior to the central sulcus, name this brain division. Name this brain division. Frontal lobe. Posterior to the central sulcus, name this brain division. Parietal lobe. We don't have a particularly good view of the temporal lobe, so we'll wait till we get to the human brain before we look at the temporal lobe there. But in the back of the brain, this area, name this area. Occipital lobe. And finally, name this brain division. Cerebellum. Now let's continue our view when we're looking at the inferior aspect of our lateral aspect of our brain here. Here I can see the frontal lobe. Here I can see the parietal lobe, and temporal lobe not particularly visible. Here is the cerebellum, spinal cord, and now we can look at this area called the brainstem. But to see the brainstem, let's look at the inferior view. Here we'll start off by looking at the posterior view before we get there. And in this case, I've reflexed back the cerebellum so I can look into the brain here. When I look into the brain here, I expose this structure here, this four-part structure here. Name this entire structure. Name this entire structure. Corpora quadrigemina. And the two parts, the top two parts of that structure, name these top two structures here. Superior colliculi. Colliculi, plural, colliculus would be singular. Name these paired structures here. Inferior colliculus or inferior colliculi. The cerebellar peduncles, I really can't see at this view. I'm going to have to turn the brain over to see that part. But what I can see is this little single structure right there. Unusual in the brain because it's really not a bipartite structure like almost everything else in the brain is. It is a single completely fused element. Name that structure the pineal gland. Now let's look at the inferior view. And the first thing you want to do when you look at any structure here is to orient yourself. And the way to orient yourself on the inferior side of the brain is to find the most obvious thing, which is going to be this crossing over of axons here. These point where it crosses, this is going to be called the optic chiasm. If this is the optic chiasm, these are axons headed to visual processing stations in the brain. Name the white matter here. Name the white matter. Optic tract. Anterior to the optic chiasm, name this white matter. Name this white matter. That's going to be the optic nerve. Now once I've oriented myself here, I'm going to look just posterior to that. And this is where the pituitary gland would normally be located, but in the sheep, pituitary gland for some reason is huge. It covers this entire area here, so it's been removed so we can see something below there. So the pituitary gland is not visible in this view. But the pituitary gland would be connected to the brain by this stalk that remains on our brain. So name this stalk that connects the brain to the pituitary gland, be the infundibulum. Infundibulum. The brainstem that we saw in the previous view extends this entire structure here. The top of the brainstem, this entire area, is going to be called the midbrain. And on the midbrain, I can see now the cerebellar peduncles, one on this side, one on that side. Just inferior to the midbrain, going to be this structures here that sort of pouch out a bit. Name that structure. Pons. Name this entire structure here, still part of the brainstem. Medulla oblongata. Moving to the anterior side of the brain, name this structure. Name this structure, olfactory bulb, and the tracts going back into the brain. Name the white matter, olfactory tract. Here, this nerve, so this white matter nerve, name this white matter nerve. It's going to be the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. Cranial nerve number 4 is here labeled as number 17. Name this white matter, the trochlear nerve. Very large division of the nerve here. I can see one here, one here. Very robust piece of nerve that's been trimmed off here. Name that cranial nerve, trigeminal nerve. Continuing posterior, only one of these survives here. Name this white matter. See how it comes from just below the pons here. Going to be the abducens nerve. Now the rest of the cranial nerves are not visible here, so we're going to see them on the model or on the plastic model, and we really can't make any headway here, so we'll leave this at that. Let's do one more. Name this nerve, oculomotor, and now let's move on to our next view. Now we're looking at a mid-sagittal view. And here in the mid-sagittal view, one of the things that's really prominent is going to be this structure right here. So this is the anterior side. This this area here from 21 to 20, this is going to be the corpus callosum. So that's going to be how we're going to orient ourselves here. At the most posterior aspect of the corpus callosum, name the structure. Cingulate gyrus. Just inferior to the corpus callosum are these spaces here. Name that space. Name the space. Lateral ventricle. We have something called the septum pellucidum. It turns out in the brain there's a membrane partition that divides the left and right half of the lateral ventricles here. It's been removed here, but that would be just a membrane window that you can see separating the two halves of the lateral ventricle. Below the corpus callosum, this structure, name this structure, fornix. Below the fornix, big round structure here, top of the brainstem. Here's the brainstem. Name this structure, thalamus. The thalami are connected by a little bridge that's going to be called the intermediate mass. They're not particularly well visible here, but it would just be a little circular structure that we can often see if we get the section just right. If this is the thalamus, the epithalamus is a division right at the very superior border of the thalamus, little structure of cells that called the epithalamus. So if this is the thalamus, then right below it, name this area is the hypothalamus. And right below the hypothalamus is going to be the pituitary gland, which is here shown as structure 18. Structure 23, name this structure, the optic chiasm. And now let's look at the brainstem. So first of all, we can pick out, name this little pouched out structure here, the pons. Superior to the pons, the midbrain. Inferior to the pons, medulla oblongata. Here, pineal body here, inferior to the pineal body. Name this structure, superior colliculus. Name this structure, inferior colliculus. This is the lateral ventricle, and the third ventricle is this space right here. So lateral ventricle, third ventricle. And now I need to connect the third ventricle to the rest of the brain here. And that's going to be due to the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct is this space here, labeled 10. And the cerebral aqueduct leads to this space on the outside. Name this space. It is the fourth ventricle. Name this structure seen in mid-sagittal section, cerebellum. Name the white matter within the cerebellum, arbor vitae. Here, the gray matter on the outside of the cerebellum. Let's move on to our next view. Now this is our coronal section. In our coronal section, now I can clearly see that the gray matter is on the outside of the brain where it can get exposure to the cerebral spinal fluid. Name this area, cerebral cortex. Here I can see white matter. These are where the axons are that are connecting the various parts of the brain together. The white matter bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain. Name this structure, corpus callosum. Let's move to our next view. Here, in our cross-section of our vertebra, we can see that the organization is reversed. Now, gray matter is on the inside and white matter is on the outside. And let's orient ourselves here. I can see here the spinous process. So this must be the dorsal or posterior side, and making this the anterior side. Let's look at the spinal nerves here, the roots here, and because this is the dorsal side, this root, name this nerve root, it's going to be the dorsal root. And as I follow the dorsal root, I come to the dorsal root ganglion, where the cell bodies for the sensory neurons that populate the dorsal root are located. Here, this is going to be the dorsal horn. So the dorsal root sensory neurons enter to the dorsal horn. Here, the ventral horn, because it's on the ventral side. This is the ventral root, because it's on the ventral side. The ventral root carrying motor neurons, and they fuse here, and now they split. The spinal nerve splits into an anterior ramus and a posterior ramus. So every one of the spinal nerves are going to have this basic organization and this basic demarcation between anterior and posterior ramus. Let's look at the coverings of the brain. The outermost covering here. Name this covering, name the structure, dura mater. Below that is going to be the arachnoid matter. And name the structure that's fused right onto the spinal cord, be the pia matter. Now what we want to find is the space. The call will come, name the space. And since we're outside of the dura, it is the epidural space. Here, I'm below the arachnoid matter. This will be the arachnoid space. This is where the blood vessels will run, in the arachnoid space. Let's take another look where we're just looking at the spinal cord itself. And in this case, here I can see the dorsal root ganglion, so I know this is the dorsal side. Name this area, name this structure. And the answer is the posterior median sulcus. The little hole goes right down the middle of the spinal cord, carrying cerebral spinal fluid to nourish these cells. Name that hole. And the answer is the central canal. Finally, name the structure, the indentation on now the anterior side of the spinal cord, and the answer is anterior median fissure. So that's our tour of the CNS anatomy. Hope this helps. Let me know if you need any more help.